You're listening to The Josh Bernstein Show.
Okay, we are back. My guest today is a well-respected internist, and nuclear cardiologist here in Phoenix, Arizona. He is also a former lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy who served 11 years as a medical officer, including a tour as a staff internist to Congress and the Supreme Court. He is also a world-renowned terrorism expert who routinely briefs members of Congress on the threat of Islamic extremism. He is a patriot, an American, and a Muslim. He is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. It is my honor to welcome to the show Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Josh. Thanks for having me in studio.
Good. Well, before we kind of get into all the stuff about ISIS and Iraq and everything else, I wanted to ask you, I know what an internist is, and I know what a cardiologist is. What exactly is a nuclear cardiologist?
Well, one niche within cardiology is imaging of the heart with stress testing especially. And I have a board certification. I got specialized in stress testing imaging using nuclear isotopes just to look for coronary disease in a non-invasive way. So rather than get a invasive cardiac angiogram, part of my internal medicine primary care practice is not only to do regular treadmills, but nuclear stress testing to look for the most common disease that 500,000 people die every year, which is coronary disease.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you for explaining that. So how does a nuclear cardiologist become one of the world's most renowned experts on Islamic extremism?
Well, it has to do with the attention that America had to this issue after 9/11. I'm not a post-9/11 activist. I've been involved in what I consider to be central reforms within the Muslim community since I was in college. I wrote a book called A Battle for the Soul of Islam that's available on Amazon and from Simon & Schuster that basically talks about my personal history and the struggles I had against some of the old guard in our community. And unfortunately, the Muslim Brotherhood movement was sprouted in America in the late 60s with the Muslim Student Association. And when I went to the University of Wisconsin, I learned about the MSA and how the Muslim Brotherhood really does not see the West about liberty and freedom. It sees it as a anti-Islamic, hedonistic, secular, autocratic. It has a very propagandistic approach to the West. And I divide Muslims really into simply two groups, those that came here to absorb Western freedoms to reform our faith versus those that are here for evangelical reasons to spread political Islam. And I was fighting that. My family built over 4 mosques in America in various towns. We helped build the one in Scottsdale right around 9/11. And that's my faith component. After 9/11, America needed to realize that 9/11 was not simply a one-off, that it was the byproduct of a global movement of radical Islam for a century, and that really violence is the tip of the iceberg of a bigger problem, which is often nonviolent, which is political Islam, no different than communism was more than just the Soviets. It was a global movement of socialism and anti-democratic mindset, and Islamism is the theocratic movement of radical Islam. And ultimately, we formed the American Islamic Forum for Democracy as private citizens here in Phoenix, and it spread after we tried to have a rally. We had a good rally against terrorism in Patriot Square in 2004, and slowly it became a voice for moderates, for those that are willing to take on the ideologies of political Islam and are not apologists about the faith that we love.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I wanted to touch on ISIS. We're going to go into a whole bunch of different things, but America has spent over $17 billion in Iraq since 2003. At 11 years, it is one of the longest wars in U.S. history. Yet, we were able to topple the Saddam Hussein regime and bring stability to Iraq. Now, all these years later, all of those gains have now been lost as ISIS terrorists have waited out Obama's, in my opinion, moronic timetable, and now have captured Kirkuk, Tikrit, Samarra, Mosul, and possibly even Baghdad. In your opinion, why has this been allowed to happen, and how can we stop it?
Well, nature abhors a vacuum, and into every vacuum it would be filled by evil, typically, or Darwin's. I call our policy, since Obama took office in 2008, a Darwin policy, where we sort of let the world's worst actors that have the most money, the most military, sort of fill in vacuums wherever we leave them. And his withdrawal out of Iraq has allowed there to be a vacuum that's been filled, and we've had no strategy. So ISIS is not the problem. ISIS is a simple, like Al-Qaeda wasn't the problem in 9/11. ISIS is a manifestation of a region in which there was an opportunity in 2011, which was the Arab awakening, where you saw countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and then Libya and Syria, in which dictators that have long, which I describe as pressure cookers, they've maintained their societies suffocated through the worst dictatorships in humanity and caused actually the radicalization of various groups to foment and destroy any chance of moderates ever surviving. And the opportunity of the Arab awakening removed that pressure cooker. And just like a pressure cooker, you can have spaghetti all over the ceiling if you don't control it and have other pathways. And this is what's happening. And when we left Iraq, Victor Davis Hanson had a great piece in the National Review a few weeks ago in which he said, never in history has there ever been the removal of a dictatorship and an invasion of a country that didn't work unless there was an occupation for a certain period of time. And if you look in Korea, Germany, etc., you can't go in and unroof 2 generations of dictatorship in Iraq and expect them to turn on the lights of Jeffersonian democracy in 2 years. That doesn't happen. So they needed chaperoning. And surely, as dysfunctional as they are, it was much more functional with us in the neighborhood. And any Iraqi will tell you that. Maliki became part of the Iranian hemisphere, and they annexed Syria. And sure enough, and as General Keane reported in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, he said, very interesting that ISIS's areas in Syria were not being bombed by Assad. They were being left alone while he decimated the moderate neighborhoods in Damascus and Aleppo and Idlib and all the other cities, because those were the biggest threats to dictatorship. ISIS provides the fuel to say that he needs to have an autocratic dictatorship, and he unleashed them into Iraq to help Maliki do the same thing with the Sunnis in the north that he was trying to quell and find also a reason to say that there's chaos in Iraq.
I mean, could you imagine if, back in any one of the world wars, but even World War II, if we told Germany, hey, by the way, we're going to go in there, we're going to take you out, we're going to do everything we can, and then, by the way, this is when we're leaving, okay? I mean, if we would have done that through history, we never would have probably even been America, number one, but we wouldn't have been able to win these wars. I don't understand. I guess it's the political correctness. It's the pressure, if you will, from the anti-war left on America to say, we can't go into these countries, we can't try to help these people out and this and that. And then obviously they talk about, WMDs and all that other stuff, but it's just you can't have a timetable and go to war.
But Josh, it's also a lack of vision. President Reagan, when he started talking about the Soviet Union and the threat, and ultimately we believe his policy, as conservatives, we believe his policy was ultimately why the wall fell without firing a single bullet directly against the Soviets. But he did that at every press conference. He slowly shifted the needle in public opinion to believe that we had to be peace through strength was a policy, that ultimately calling them the evil empire was necessary rather than apologetically kneeling before the Soviet dictators that existed at the time. And that peace through strength worked. Without a strategy in the Middle East, the tribal mafia of the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has been walking all over American interest. President Obama leaned over before the elections and told the Russians, who are now controlling and funding and militarizing many of these dictatorships, he told them, he said, give me some time till after the election, basically telling them and proving that Romney was right, that, Assad would not still be around if it wasn't for 2 things, Russia and Iran, that would have changed and you would have had more of a lean towards democracy. And there's been a vacuum with no vision about a third pathway for the Middle East, which would be that of liberty rather than secular fascism, the Nazis of the Middle East versus the Islamists of Iran or the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. That's a great point. And, and I've said this before, that when he leaned over and said, I can have more flexibility after my election, that was probably the pivotal moment in Vladimir Putin's mind to say, this guy is a paper tiger. He is weak. He is not going to stand up to me. And therefore, I think that emboldened him to go into Ukraine and do some of the other things that he did.
And conservatives need to figure out how to unify our community in a strategy where we are not saying that we just need to pull out of everything in the world and let the Darwin dominate.
Now, let me ask you on this one here. As a former Lieutenant Navy commander, what do you think about the rules of engagement that our soldiers must adhere to? Do you think that it has prolonged the Iraq War, and do you think it's dangerous?
We might need to be a little more specific on which rules you're talking about, but I do think...
Basically wait to be shot at first before you shoot back. Some of these other crazy things where, they're going into one neighborhood in one town in one house, and they're destroying it or taking the terrorists out, but yet they're building up, the next street or the next area. Over here, they're building the school, but this one they're blowing up. I mean, you can't fight a politically correct war. If you're going to go in, you got to go in and do it right.
And this is we've seen this in every war, and it's, on the one hand, it shows that we are the leaders of the free world, the conscience of humanity. Human rights do mean something to us. So yes, our soldiers, and having served as a doc in the Navy, we went to Somalia. We saw, as we tried to simply take them food, we were told that we were imperializing, and we suffered as a result of living by a set of values that no one else in the world does, I believe, other than those in the West. And ultimately, I will tell you that, yes, political correctness I wrote a piece that was controversial in 2005 and 6 where a lot of the radicals in Iraq were firing out of mosques. And we were losing troops because our troops were refusing to shoot into mosques. And as a Muslim, I wrote, I said, in Islamic history, once a mosque becomes used as a place of war and it's fired out of as a bulwark in war, it's no longer a mosque. It becomes a building that is being used as a shield in war, and therefore firing into it is not inappropriate. Well, many said, well, even though theologically you might be right, you shouldn't be writing that because it sort of inflames passions and everything. And I said, listen, we are losing our sons and daughters because of odd rules of engagement that are actually beyond the Geneva Convention.
Right.
The Geneva Convention, I'll tell you as a doctor, if physicians and nurses were carrying weapons, they become targets. And Geneva Convention says that if an ambulance starts, firing and becoming part of the war, it's no longer an ambulance. So there's a lot of rules that are even in the Geneva Convention are protected to allow rational thought in war. And we've lost our rational thought, and we see the shutting down of Gitmo. We just turned over 5 of the leaders of the Taliban movement for a man. Yes, okay, fine. We bring back all of our guys, no matter what they are. But Bergdahl is proving to be a significant traitor who I think shows that this country actually has no value. And they're going to start taking American citizens because they think they can get somebody back in trade.
Yeah, they called it a victory. And, one of the most abhorrent, disgusting images I think I've seen in years was him embracing his father. And then his father, Bergdahl's father, saying something, an Islamic prayer in the American White House garden. To me, I thought that was extremely uncalled for, offensive. And then Barack Obama again, goes and gives him a big hug after all that. And you're right. I mean, if you would have gotten somebody that was not a defector, someone that stood up for his platoon, maybe took some shrapnel to save other people's lives, and they captured him. Okay, I could understand, but not even 5, because you don't negotiate with terrorists, because then what happens? They expect that, and it emboldens them more to go out and kidnap more American soldiers.
And still the narrative, even though every one of his soldiers that were with him said that he deserted and that he needs the UCMJ full press on him, the media still was saying that somehow this was some type of Obama thing, anti-Muslim, whatever it was. The bottom line is the reality is that the narrative, you have a president whose main book he carries around is Fareed Zakaria's CNN book on post-American world. He views the current situation and policies that somehow American exceptionalism is no longer important. And I'll tell you, as the son of Syrians that escaped Ba'ath oppression to come to this country to be able to practice our faith more freely than anywhere in the world, I don't want to live in a world that's post-American because no one else is going to defend those who want freedom.
3,000 years of darkness, God forbid America falls. I want to ask you this. Sunni and Shiites have been fighting each other for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They have had numerous battles, including most recently the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. Do you think partitioning off of the country, essentially splitting Iraq into different regions, will actually help quell the violence?
Well, they've been talking about this in Syria. They've been talking about Iraq. Certainly one of the safest spaces in the Middle East is Kurdistan, where the Kurds are, and we can get into that for various reasons. But I will tell you that, for example, as these dictatorships leave, you see, or depart in their military influence, you see a return of the old 1,400-plus battles between Sunni and Shia, that sectarian strife where the Shia were a schism from early Islam after the Prophet died, where they said that the leadership of the Islamic Ummah faith community needed to be a descendancy through Ali. And while yet we read the same Quran, pray to the same God, and mosques in America, I often can't tell who's Sunni and who's Shia. And the reason is because America's construct, our contract here, is about pluralism. It's about freedom and liberty. So that's why the only way to rise up above the old tribal wars that now you see Saudi Arabia and Iran, Sunni Shia coming on the edge of some conflicts also, to rise above that, you have to say, you know what? There needs to be an end to that 20th century autocracy where we said the enemy of our enemy is our friend, so therefore we hug the Saudis even though they created Al-Qaeda with their ideologies. Or we hug the Pakistani generals who are dictators who fuel radicalism just because they were worried about the nukes that they have. And
right.
I understand the regional dynamics. I'm not saying to abandon that, but we can't just have this old paradigm anymore. And the Sunni-Shia conflict, it's about Islamism. The main ideological conflict of the 21st century that I hope your listeners in America wakes up to, it's about liberty versus political Islam. And the Islamists of the Shia are the Khomeinists and the Hezbollah radicals. The Islamists of the Sunnis are the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt that ultimately are the main threat. You can use whatever flavor you want, the Coke and Pepsi, the radicals of each side. But until you diffuse their oxygen, which is political Islam, and our organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, is all about separation of mosque and state. And we have Sunnis and Shia that help us. It's about separating mosque and state that will allow any type of manifestation of Islam to be a personal faith and separate Sharia or Islamic law out of the domain of government.
Well, and Sharia law has been talked about a lot in the American courts here in America. You have possibly leftist radical judges that will look to international law, to look to Sharia law, will allow honor killings to happen. It happened in Buffalo, New York. It happened in Texas with the two daughters, the two 16-year-old daughters. It happened in Phoenix with the gentleman who ran over his daughter with an SUV. I mean, so you have this creeping Sharia, which, again, there's actually a website called that, but you have this creeping Sharia into our courts. I think from our standpoint as Americans that we need to come up with some kind of either amendment or something for each state to allow all law to only be through American.
And the ones we supported, people can go to AmericanIslamicLeadership.org to see Muslims that really support the protection of American freedoms, because the ones I'll tell you that identified Sharia as a problem, we did not support, because Sharia to a Muslim is like saying Islam, it's God's law. But the ones that said that never should foreign law, be it Sharia or anything, conflict with the protection of the equality of men and women, conflict with the protection of property rights of women in their marriages, etc., then those should be prevented. Arbitration systems should not be insulated. And you see so many women. This is why women's movements were part of what, in the Muslim community, believed in us supporting the American Law for American Courts movement in Michigan and in Florida and in Arizona here, because it said, you know what, you can't insulate. The imams can't tell the woman who comes to their mosque, oh, go back, even if your husband's beating you, try to work it out. You don't have to be divorced. This stuff happens, and it's insulated under arbitration. And the federal system and our state system should be overseeing these things and protecting American values.
Right. Which to me, in some ways, amazes me that liberals, women, which are more liberal than men for the most part, that they allow this type of behavior to give a pass because of political correctness. Yeah. What they don't understand is that, God forbid, there was Sharia law enacted in America, that women would be, I mean, I don't want to get graphic, but clitorectomies, being accused of adultery because 5 men decided that, they didn't like her, and all these crazy things that go on. We cannot have that in the American courts under any circumstance. So I wanted to ask you, let's talk a little bit here about Egypt. Hosni Mubarak was removed from power in 2011, and since then the Egyptian military and the Muslim Brotherhood have been battling for control of the government. We know that the Muslim Brotherhood has been removed from power, and the Egyptian military is now keeping security for the country for the most part. The president would not condemn the Muslim Brotherhood and even continues to send millions of dollars to Egypt in foreign aid. How close are the president's ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, and how deep are those ties in Washington?
Well, that's a great question. I think within Egypt is a clinic of all the problems of a lack of strategy from the Obama administration. Not only lack of strategy, but the fact that his closest advisors, like, for example, Mohammed al-Bieri, who's in the Homeland Security Department, who clearly ran an organization called Freedom and Justice Foundation, supported Sayyid Qutb, one of the ideological philosophers, founders of the Muslim Brotherhood in the early 20th century, and so many examples that he is an Islamist ideologue in the Obama administration. And as a result, what happens is these are the advisors, so they push them towards saying that somehow all Muslims are fated to be run by Islamists. It's no different than the Brits and others who were in America during our revolution saying that, Christianity was doomed to being run by the Church of England. And that's just not true. You had a revolution. Right. So in Egypt, Revolution 1.0 was getting rid of Mubarak, and the history of Nasser said that, this ruthless dictatorship that existed for 60 years. Revolution 2.0 showed that Muslims aren't destined to that. You had 10 times as many Egyptians in the streets in Cairo saying that, we don't want the Islamist thugs. They're worse than the Mubarak was. Right. But I'll tell you, that 1 year of an opening of Egypt did more to destroy the Islamist movement than 60 years of dictatorship, and they were able to push them out. The problem is that we've not had anybody in Washington making policy with brains enough to say, maybe the Egyptians don't want either of those choices, right, and they want a third pathway. So as a result, the current last 50 years of lobbying coming from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other billion-dollar movements in the West has been to basically position Islamists in places of influence in Washington to convince them that any Muslim must be Islamist and be a Brotherhood sympathizer, and that's sort of what Islam is, when in fact that's just not true. The millions in the streets in Cairo were not Muslim Brotherhood. They were Muslims, but they did not want theocracy, and that's really where Egypt is now. El-Sisi, in some ways, is better than the Brotherhood, but has returned to a cult of dictatorship with his picture all over the place, and it's saddening to me to see, on the one hand, an attack on Sisi means that I'm somehow pro-Brotherhood, when in fact I'm neither. And the administration, because of its apologetics about the Brotherhood, now being against El-Sisi is proving that it is pro-Brotherhood, when in fact we should be against both forms of autocracy.
Gotcha. Excellent. Good point there. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about Islam in general and some of the different things in the Quran. Okay? All right, we'll be right back. Okay, we are back. In case you are just joining us, we are talking to world-renowned terrorism expert, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser, a lot of moderate, peaceful Muslims like yourself, they claim to say that Islam is a peaceful religion. What I want to kind of read you a couple of verses from the Quran. 3-56. As to those who reject faith, I will punish thee with terrible agony in this world and in the hereafter. 2-191-193. Slay them wherever ye may find them, and drive them out from wherever they, the infidels, may hide. For persecution of Muslims is worse than slaughter of non-believers and the infidels. And my personal favorite, 8-12, I will cast terror into the hearts of the non-believers and smite their necks and strike off their heads. So my question is, how can a religion call itself a religion of peace when one of its basic tenets is to not recognize the existence of other faiths?
Well, I would disagree with that premise, in that, first of all, if Islam itself taught terrorism as a core tenet, as the interpretation that you offered of these passages, my sense is the world would have ended a long time ago. It would have perished. You're talking about a quarter of the world's population. But that's unapologetic, because at the end of the day, there's no doubt that we have a major problem in our faith interpretation from these radical groups. We're trying to treat it. The only treatment would be the advancement of liberty, and that advancement needs to come with Muslims waking up. To me, I look at it like a drug addiction problem. It's no different than families that are sitting around using heavy drugs, and then they're saying, gosh, we have a violence problem. Why are our kids getting killed in drug-related violence? And they don't put the two and two together. They say, you know what? What is the drug here? Is it Islam, the faith? I don't believe so. Islam, the faith, is what gives me the humility and the honesty and integrity to treat my patients, to be an American, to do all the things that I do is good. But it is political Islam, the supremacist doctrine that believes Western society, secular societies based in reason are evil, and that the society should be based in Islam and theology. Looking in these, or theocracy, looking in these passages, 356 and 812, the first and last one you read, it says I. That's God talking to individuals, not government, not human beings. Yes, the Quran, no different than the Old Testament, has a lot of hell and brimstone in it, in which God puts fear into man and women and telling them, if you don't believe in me, that's the greatest sin. And what will happen to an individual if they don't believe in God? That's I. That's not the I as in God, not I as in Al-Qaeda or as in the Saudi government, which they believe they are God. And that's why you have to separate mosque and state. The second one is much more complicated, and I think is where we have a lot of reforms to do, where it says slay those that disagree with you and slay the infidel. I talk about this in my book. The last chapter of my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, is about misinterpretations of the Quran. And I served in the Navy, and if we were in Afghanistan and the general in his charge of operations in Kabul came up to us and said, slay the Taliban where you find them in this operation, that would not be an evil thing. That would be a very patriotic, moral thing to say.
Right.
So if you have a passage related to, Muslims are not pacifists. There's just war, as there is just war in Catholicism and in Judaism and others. If we are being told that there are pagans attacking Muslims, and there's a passage there related to a battle in 612 AD, and it says, peace has not worked. This is one of the last passages, by the way, revealed before all the other passages that said, about peaceful and other aspects of morality. If it says to Muslims, slay them where you find them because they violated the treaties, etc., that is related to 612. It's not related to 800, to 2001, 9/11, which was a evil act of barbarism. So it doesn't profile it into ad infinitum, and that's what the Islamists and the Wahhabis do. They then take a Quran that says that we may marry Christians and Jews in the most holy institution on humanity, which is marriage, and yet says that somehow they are not our friends, we must slay them, which is just irrational and could not be from the same God.
Okay. Why do you think, and maybe it's probably a worldwide thing, but more here in America, why do you think that there are not as many peaceful Muslims like yourself that are speaking out loudly? And my thing is that if you're not speaking out loudly about some of the atrocities that are going on and the bad name, if you will, for the Muslim faith here in America, not completely, but obviously we hear about all these different things, I can only say that means that you either are apathetic or you're complacent or you possibly agree with the behaviors of the Islamic extremisms. Now, I'm not saying that you would then go out and enact them and blow yourself up or something crazy like that. But the fact is that you're remaining silent. Are American Muslims afraid to speak out, and why don't they speak out?
That's a great question, and that's a struggle we have as we try to grow our constituency and grassroots that we have. I'll give you three parts to that answer. Okay. Number one is education. I believe that many of the Muslim community in America came from the societies that my family escaped, and my grandparents and father and mother were blessed with being educated. And my father was educated in London, and my grandfather was a newspaper man who understood Western democracy. Many Muslims who come to this country, sort of the American experiment hasn't been taught to them about what Jeffersonian religious freedom was all about, and what is the oxygen of how a very religious society cannot have, the Constitution be a religious document. So that, as hard as it is for Americans to understand how that can happen in Islam, Muslims still have been stuck with thinking secularism is dictatorship. Secondly is the drive. I think Americans give Muslims a pass on putting a fire under my colleagues' feet, my co-religionists' feet, and saying, you know what? You guys need to wake up, and you're no different than the Germans that were silent under the Nazis.
Right.
If you don't speak up against not the violence, but the ideas that fuel this, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Israeli topics that get sucked into these issues, the apologetics that somehow just about peace and violence and not about the ideologies and supremacism. So 2 is the drive. 3 is fear. Yes, I've been attacked. I've had death threats against my work from Al-Qaeda groups in Syria. We get intimidated by groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations and Muslim Public Affairs Council that basically lets the rest of the Muslim community know that, well, if you speak up against Islamist groups like those groups, you will pay a price and you will be ostracized and said that you're an Islamophobe. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation and these groups label me as an Islamophobe, even though anyone who knows me here locally, especially in Phoenix, knows that we're very religious. My family participates in mosque activities. I'm fasting now in Ramadan, thank God. And, my personal faith is quite orthodox and devotional. But I'm not part of the Islamist movement, and I work vociferously against them. So, you pay a price of fear, and there is some fear from that, but American Muslims need to set that aside.
They do. They really do, because I think that if they were a louder voice and they were more vocal and, you're in America, you're protected. You have the Constitution, you have freedom. You don't have to worry. Now, granted, if you go back to, Syria or Iraq or Iran, that could be a problem. But you're here.
Yep.
And you escaped there to come here for a reason, because you don't believe in that ideology and you want that freedom. So if you're here, you might as well speak up and speak up loudly. We are just about out of time. Please tell us where we can find you, all the information that you're doing. Tell us about your book, and also tell us about your organization, please.
Well, thank you. And I'll tell you, I think since the Syrian Revolution, a lot of American Syrians, for example, that are Muslim are saying, you know what, gosh, our families don't know if they're going to be alive tomorrow. And they realize that the freedoms we have here, we need to pay back to our country and be more active in fixing the problem, which is preventing the reforms necessary because of the old guard that runs mosques and organizations. Our organization is the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Our 2 main projects that we do are the Muslim Liberty Project that targets young Muslim adults for reforms of liberty, and the American Islamic Leadership Coalition. Our website is AIF, as in forum, AIFdemocracy.org, and AmericanIslamicLeadership.org. My book is Battle for the Soul of Islam. You can go to its website, battleforthesoulofislam.com, and it talks about all of these solutions and controversies and what Americans should be doing. And please follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, DrZuhdi, Jasser, Jasser.
All right. Well, fantastic. Thank you again so much for being here. I will definitely have you back on. You'll be like yourself and Waleed Perez, you two will be kind of my confidants when something happens and we need to, bring attention to it and have people talk about it.
Waleed's a great friend.
He's a great guy, and you are as well. And again, thank you so much, and God bless you. And
thank you, Josh. God bless.